For the last part of section 1, let's talk a little bit about self-confidence and motivation. Self-confidence in many ways is really kind of related to motivation. Now, before we start moving forward and talking about self-confidence, I do think it's important to review some basic ideas of motivation. You've probably heard of the 3 types of motivation, but I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about those real quickly here for a second. So the first is intrinsic motivation. And this is when you are internally driven, right? You don't necessarily need to be told to do something. You want to do whatever the task is. If it's getting ready for practice, if it's, studying for a class, you are motivated internally. The opposite of that is going to be extrinsic motivation, right? And it's where the environment or other people, something that's external to the individual, is what's actually driving that person forward. It's helping to get them from point A to point B, from point B to point C, so on and so forth. Okay? And we'll talk more about extrinsic motivation and kind of the nuances there. And then finally, there's amotivation. And this is really just, motivation isn't really part of the process. You're not internally motivated. Extrinsic motivation doesn't necessarily work. You've entered into an amotivated state of mind, which is not necessarily bad, but in terms of athletic performance or entertainment performance and things like that, we do know that practice and repetition and those types of things are going to be really important. And so that's the way that motivation is going to help kind of click into that process of outcomes or achieving goals. Now, identifying the relationship of motivation and self-confidence I think is important because it really describes this process that the coach or the manager, the leader, this is how you're going to reach people. This is how you're going to connect with. This is how you're going to build the types of relationships that you need to build so that both the individual athlete, for example, and the team can be successful moving forward. We'll talk about 2 basic theories of looking at and trying to, understand self-confidence. But what they have in common, regardless of kind of the unique aspects of the theory, is that both really are predicated upon this following causal relationship. And it's very, very simple, right? Self-confidence is associated with improved performance, right? And a lot of people are focusing on the outcome of performance. That's what we want to increase, or that's what we want to evolve or change. Well, one of the antecedents, one of the ways to address that is through working on the self-confidence of the individual. So if you remember Albert Bandura, we talked about him back when we were looking at theories of personality and social learning theory and those types of things. Well, this is kind of an extension of that. He talks about self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is a very important concept. It's always been very popular, but it's really kind of entered into the public consciousness over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's this idea that you have a strong belief in yourself, that you can organize and complete tasks that you decide are important. Okay? Now, the thing about self-efficacy is, yes, it's a belief in yourself that you can accomplish what needs to be accomplished, but it's also going to be specific to a context, right? And if you remember, we talk about sport-specific confidence. So you might be an elite athlete in, you might be a sprinter, and you feel very confident, and you have a high self-efficacy in the belief that you can accomplish anything in regards to running your particular race, right? But maybe in other aspects of your life, your self-efficacy is somewhat limited, or it's kind of hit a ceiling, that type of thing. So that's what we talk about. Self-efficacy being bound by a particular context. Okay? That's really, really important. Now, the other thing is that, according to Albert Bandura, is that there's 4 major elements that are going to play a part in developing self-efficacy. All right? The very first one is successful performance. So this is very simple, right? You believe that you can accomplish something, a particular task, maybe it's hitting a 3-point shot or hitting a slider or whatever it is that you do in your particular sport. You believe you can accomplish that because you've done it before. All right, very, very simple. Vicarious experience. And this is, okay, it's not necessarily you, but You see other people doing it, right? So you're modeling, you're role modeling. That kind of goes back to Bandura talking about that social learning, right? The importance of role modeling. But the thing about vicarious experience that's so important is it is literally the foundation for practice, right? You need to have repetitions. And the way that you do that is through practice. You get good. You understand the technical aspect of the skill. You get good at putting the skill together and combining it with other skills. And then maybe, the cognitive part of whatever your game is in terms of looking at offenses or defenses or thinking about strategy, those types of things, right? And so vicarious experience, being able to imitate and then start to internalize that and learn it, that's what practice is. And Bandura was saying that's an important part of building that self-efficacy. Another one is verbal persuasion. And we'll talk more about self-talk in the future, but really it's being able to give voice and think about your belief and saying that you believe you can accomplish something. From a coach's point of view or even a manager's point of view, oftentimes we use the positive coaching sandwich, right? And you've probably heard about this, but it's especially useful with younger athletes. That's not to say you shouldn't be using it when you're dealing with older athletes. You should, but it's crucial when you're dealing with amateur athletes. Is that you identify a positive remark. So nice job, Mark, right? And then you're going to insert whatever the coaching point is. So nice job, Mark. You're dropping your shoulder. Make sure you get your shoulder up. Swing through the zone on a level plane. Those types of things, right? So you go the positive. You do the coaching moment where you identify what needs to change, and then you follow that up with a positive again. So nice job, Mark. You're dropping your shoulder. You need to make sure you keep your shoulder up and swing through the plane of the zone. Nice work. That was a good at bat, or whatever it is, right? So you want to juxtapose the criticism with the buffer of some positive on each end of that. And all that is, it's a way that you can engage with someone. And now, whether you're engaging with yourself or if you're coaching someone, that sort of verbal persuasion, walking through that process, is important for the belief in being able to be successful. If I'm playing baseball and I'm standing in the batter's box and I'm trying to hit a particular pitch, okay, which is what that example was about. Finally, is emotional arousal. And this was, I think, really interesting because it's often overlooked, right? Is that for you to believe that you can accomplish something, one way of doing that is to learn a lot about it. And we deal with this a lot when we have students that are wanting to come through our programs. And one way that we can kind of measure how invested that they are in something is, have they done research on a particular job or occupation? If someone says, oh yeah, I'd love to be the GM of whatever the particular, professional franchise is. Well, okay, that's a difficult goal. It's a very limited number of positions. So what are you doing to learn about that particular job? And that attention and willingness to learn, that's really interesting, because when you start adding the cognitive aspect to whatever strategy or game or sport that you're a part of, that's when you start really developing an understanding for thinking through what you think will happen in the future, right? So you've probably heard the phrase, instead of playing checkers, let's play chess. And it's really about trying to think a couple of moves ahead from your opponent, so that you can kind of get a sense for where they're going to go, and that you can sort of intercept them at that particular movement. And that sense of being locked in terms of both emotion and cognition, that's really important, because if you believe that you know a lot about a particular sport, all the technical aspects and those types of things, then your belief in yourself that you can accomplish something, particularly strong in that particular sport is going to be much higher. In a similar way, Dr. Harter was looking at this idea of competence and how it connects with motivation. Now, we know to be competent at something means that you're pretty good at it, right? Well, kind of what Dr. Harter was saying here is that to satisfy this urge of being competent at a particular task, especially within the world of athletics or performance, is that we attempt mastery. right? So think back to, the early days of whatever a particular sport or activity you're involved with. You probably came across the 10,000 hour rule, right? So the idea is that if you practice something for, and this is a rule of thumb, right? If you practice something for about 10,000 hours, then you are close to, in a way, mastering that task. If you're successful at trying, then you promote self-efficacy and feelings of personal competence. And this is really important for Harter in this point of view, because as you feel you have competence and you feel that an ability to accomplish things, well, your friends and your peer groups can be supportive in this process as well. And then I start thinking, okay, that's kind of interesting, right? Because when you start bringing in the group aspect, well, looking at groups of amateur athletes, for example, is a really interesting way to kind of see how competence and mastery sort of operates in a social situation within sports. So here's the example that we have below. Youth sports and why do children participate? Some of these youth athletes want to get better at whatever the particular sport is, right? So they're going to attempt mastery. They're going to focus, they're going to try hard, they're going to engage in a lot of practice, a lot of repetition. Some of the athletes maybe see participating in, summer recreation sport as more of a social thing, right? Maybe there's even a third group of athletes that their family wants them as young people to be involved in sports. So they have little to no motivation to be out there. They're essentially being coerced by their family members to get out there. So what you can see with that particular example, those three distinct groups, is that the motivation will be different among all three types of those participants because of their focus, because of their reasoning for being there. So this whole notion of practicing and trying to become competent in something, it is going to be associated with a higher level of motivation. As you decrease the focus on mastery and competence, the motivation tends to decrease as well. And that's very, very commonsensical. But before Dr. Harter and his colleagues really started putting this into a theory, we hadn't necessarily articulated it in quite the open way. Another thing that really is going to impact motivation and confidence, at least I hear this from an athlete's point of view, is the idea of momentum. Now, I absolutely adore talking about momentum in class because momentum is a really interesting thing, right? Every athlete, every coach that I know, they believe in momentum, right? That momentum is this thing that can actually influence in a positive or negative way the belief, the behavior, the cognition, the performance in any sport, right? And you hear this all the time, the swing in momentum. We were ahead, we were doing well, something happened, and momentum swung against us. And I love talking about this because momentum is not anything that we can actually measure with science or social science. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it, smell it, or weigh it, right? You can only sort of feel or see in the athletic contest the alleged effects of momentum, but we can't prove that it exists. And this is something I think when you start working with athletes or performers in, high performing team situations, we go back to this William Thomas was talking about with the Thomas theorem way back in the 1920s. I think there's some ideas there that might help to explain the impact of momentum on athletics and athletes in particular. Dr. Thomas said, if you think something is real, then the consequences are going to be real. And I love that because I think there's something very simple but very powerful in it. In a non-sport setting, right? You have a little kid, they believe there's a monster under their bed. Well, there is no monster, all right? But they believe so much that there is, that their heart rate increases, right? Maybe they get scared. Maybe they're starting to sweat a little bit. Their body and their mind believes there's something underneath that bed. Therefore, the fear that they are experiencing is real. Okay, well now let's extrapolate that to a sport example. So if a basketball team feels that the momentum because of some event, maybe it's a foul, maybe it's a missed shot, maybe it's a slam dunk by the other team, whatever, if they feel the momentum has swung away from them, then incrementally, minutely, their confidence decreases, and at some points their motivation can decrease. That means you have all of these psychological factors going on that are associated with this thing that we call momentum. Momentum is, if you kind of look at it from what we were just talking about, there's little bits and pieces of causal attribution, controllability, right? Locus, stability, there's some of those aspects in there. There's also this idea of confidence, and then that's going to kind of relate to motivation. So momentum is kind of the culmination of all of these psychological things happening among individuals on a particular team in a social environment, in a social situation that has a lot of emotion, a lot of movement going on. The energy is very, very high. We tend to then perceive all of those things working together as this reified entity that is momentum. So self-confidence is exactly like it sounds like, right? Except it is more complicated than that. We know that self-confidence is related to self-esteem and self-efficacy, right? We also talked about self-efficacy being context-specific, right? So we can also have this thing called sport-specific confidence. Well, all of those things are different. Self-esteem, your global self-esteem, is really how you view yourself sort of in totality as an entire individual, right? Overall, I feel like I'm a really good person. Or overall, I feel like I need to get better at everything, right? Those are two very, very different views in regards to a global self-esteem. And so we've got this nice little scale by Dr. Rosenberg, and it's been in existence since the late 60s. And you can use these 10, 11 questions to kind of get a general sense for how someone feels about themselves. Not just in sports, not just outside of sports, but generally speaking on the whole, right? Well, as you can imagine, that's nice, but self-esteem and confidence really are a little bit more what we call highly variegated, right? They're multifaceted. There's a lot more going on in there other than just I have a positive view of myself or I have a negative view of myself. And it's also more complicated than, well, I have a positive view of myself when I play my sport and I have a negative view of myself when I'm not playing the sport. And we know that situational variables are going to impact that. And we talked about this before in terms of intersectionality in the very beginning of this particular section, but a gender identity, a racial identity, even something like age, feelings of injustice, all of these things can influence an individual and it can slowly erode their self-confidence. Well, that self-confidence then could erode their sport-specific confidence over time. We know that other social factors are extremely important to self-esteem and self-confidence. And this might be something kind of, and I use air quotes here, as simple as team cohesion, right? A team that works together and operates together as a unit and feels very close, that's very different than one that maybe is more talented but doesn't operate as close or isn't as close, right? Low cohesion means you might have more tension. More tension creates anxiety. Anxiety tends to decrease self-confidence, those types of things. So other social factors include, the interaction between the coach's behavior, and maybe your personality. When I grew up and played in sports, the way that my personality is, I was completely fine with, what they called back in the day when I was younger, quote unquote, hard coaching, right? A lot of yelling, a lot of screaming. That doesn't bother me. That's kind of what I grew up with. And in terms of my personality, I can deal with that. But not every athlete, not every individual can operate in an environment that has a coach that's yelling, screaming, and is very, difficult to be around. Okay, not good or bad, but another social factor that can increase self-confidence. And then you just flat out have the individual psychology, and just kind of going back to the example I just made. I don't know what it is about my personality traits. I don't know what it is about my personality, but that yelling coach, I don't take that as personally negative to me. I hear the message of what I need to do to get better or what the team needs to do to get better, that type of thing. But each person, as we've talked about, is different. And each person is going to understand or interpret their success and failure, causal attribution, in a different way, right? So you've got all these different things that are going to come together and operate simultaneously in a high energy sporting environment. And that's why when we talk about self-confidence, it's way more nuanced, it's way more complicated than just simply saying, oh, well, you need to believe in yourself, right? Because, oh, well, if it was just that simple, then yes, I would believe myself and we can kind of move forward. But you have all of these different social, situational, and then individualistic psychological things that are at play at one time. So as we start getting into this notion of motivation, and we'll talk more about it here in a second, but I want to take a brief second to talk about this process. It's called internalization, right? And it's a very interesting process because if you think about how do we know and believe what we know and what we believe? You're like, wow, Mark, we're talking in circles here, but just follow me on a second here. So people talk about work ethic and practice and needing to be intrinsically motivated as very important to an individual athlete's success, right? We hear that so much. Well, at some point we begin to internalize that. We begin to believe that that message is important, right? It becomes a part of who we are and it guides our behavior moving forward. And then at some point, we don't just believe that it's the way that we should do something. We know it's the way that we should be doing something, right? That is internalization. And that process of believing in whatever, that's going to influence, obviously, motivation, and it's going to influence how you go about engaging in athletics, whether you're there from a coaching point of view or whether you're there from an individual performer's point of view. It doesn't matter. Internalizing the process. How many times have you heard coaches talk about, trust the process? Well, you can only trust the process if you've internalized and believe that that process is going to lead you where you all as an individual or as a group want to be. That's internalization. And we know it's interesting because motivation is not a simple concept. We like to think it is. We talk a lot about, well, you need to motivate that athlete or motivate that employee. Well, as we just talked about on the last slide, okay, you have all these situational, social, and individual factors, right? Your personality traits, you have the things that are happening psychologically with people, you have all the things that are happening in the environment. All those are going to play a part in both confidence and motivation. I do think it's interesting because, a lot of sports psychology early on was about athletic performance. But over the last 20, 25 years, we've broadened the scope that sports psychology is not just about engaging in athletics. There's also obviously the performance aspect. It's heavily used in business now. If you've ever heard of business coaches, so people that are certified that are almost kind of it's a cross between a counselor and a mentor. And you have these folks that are executive coaches, so these CEOs of very high performing, high stressful corporations and whatnot. They do a lot of work in discussing internalization and motivation. So it's not just in the world of sports with 7-on-7 or things like that. It's also in the world of business. And then motivation is more than just coach speak, right? It's more than just cliches. It's more than just those cheesy, motivation posters that have the big, mountain and you have to climb it and all this kind of stuff. It's more than just, hiring an old basketball or softball coach and getting them to speak to your corporate group and try to ensure that they go out and increase their sales, right? Motivation is very, very nuanced. It's not just an is or ain't thing. It's not just a black or white thing. There's a whole lot of gray and it's on a spectrum. Okay, well, if we've just identified that motivation is not, this is or ain't thing, it's not an either or proposition, it's more on the spectrum or a continuum, then let's start thinking about that. Well, we know that intrinsic motivation is about internal drive, right? So that might be on a continuum, but it's a fairly small one, right? You're either kind of internally motivated or you aren't. So let's put that one aside. We know a motivation is pretty easy to examine because no motivation's involved whatsoever. So that's out of the mix. So when we start thinking about this motivation continuum, we're really looking at extrinsic motivation, right? And just by its name, it sounds like, oh, well, this is just a coach or a couple of coaches that are going to, try to use, pre-game speeches to get you excited to go out and achieve what needs to be done on whatever the competition is, right? Again, a little bit more complicated than that. So let's think about dealing with, say, high school athletes, right? Where you have amateur athletics. You have some individuals that are extremely elite within all of those athletes, but most of them, and I'll speak for those folks as a highly mediocre high school athlete, most of those individuals are not elite athletes. Most of them are not elite athletes in the sense that they study a lot of film or that they are highly motivated, right? So now the coaching staff for these particular sports, they have all these different individuals that they have to try to get motivated. And that's starting to, or excuse me, one way that you can kind of do that is to realize that extrinsic motivation as a coach, your job is going to be very nuanced. And that extrinsic motivation actually runs on its own continuum. All right. And so it starts here with external regulation as the least or the furthest away from intrinsic motivation. Okay. And the closest to intrinsic motivation is going to be this. And so this spectrum runs from here all the way to here, right? So externally regulated folks, almost 100% have to be told to go to practice, have to be told to lift weights, have to be told to put the Snickers bar down and pick up an apple and focus on nutrition, have to be told that you need to get sleep, and have to be told that, Mark, you need to study for your geology class because you have to maintain a GPA, okay? Whereas then you get all the way to integrated regulation, and yes, you have those external factors that are influencing individuals, but oftentimes this is where your veteran leaders on the team, they have gone through the process, they believe in the process, they know what they need to do. They've identified that, okay, lifting weights and engaging in off-season, engaging in team building, eating right, getting the appropriate sleep, doing what you need to do in the classroom, all of these things work together to influence us as individuals so that we can be the best versions of ourselves, but also help us be the best version of a team. All right. And so again, extrinsic motivation runs that entire continuum. And you're going to do things as a coach once you've identified exactly what kind of athlete you're dealing with. You can do different things that are connected to these categories to then make sure that these individual athletes and your team can be the most successful. All this is kind of born out of what we call SDT, or self-determination theory, right? And it's really kind of interesting because it can be applied in sports, it's been applied in healthcare, it's been applied in the business world. SDT has been applied in a number of different places, but it's a theory to explain motivation and how people are able to achieve their goals, right? So it's very, very appropriate for everything that you all want to do. But SDT notes that when their basic needs of autonomy, relatedness, and feeling competent are met, then they tend to be more motivated. And as a result, the extrinsic motivation decreases. Okay? Now, when you start thinking about how all this stuff comes together, we'll talk about this in terms of like creating a climate. Creating a climate is going to be super important for a business manager, for a leader, for a coach, right? And it's going to be about using these different aspects. When people feel that they are competent at their job, what they're supposed to be doing, if they feel that they have autonomy is really related to they feel they have the opportunity to invest, they have the opportunity to influence, they have the opportunity to decide sometimes what is important. And then relatedness is about what it sounds like, building connection. When you have those three things present in high levels, then the SDT tends to be high, and then as a result, you tend to have more motivation as an individual and as a group. In terms of an assigned reading, please make sure that you click on this link here, and you'll be able to see a nice little reading on self-determination theory and how it relates to what we do. As I was just talking about in the last slide, so STT really focuses on creating this climate, and you have all these different social and cultural factors that are going to be linked together, and the leader, whether it's a coach or a manager or something like that, the leader can create a climate that's going to be conducive for individual and organizational or team growth. And that growth is going to lead generally to better performance, and better performance is going to then lead to more motivation to continue in this cycle, right? High levels of motivation in both sports and business are going to be associated with increased feelings of connection, generally increased levels of productivity, and the individuals, whether they're athletes or employees, are going to be focused, locked in, if you will, to their tasks. They understand their job. They understand how their job and their tasks relate to other people's jobs and so on and so forth. And really what you start to do is you're starting to build the beginnings of a strong organizational culture or of strong team cohesion. How do you wrap up everything that we've talked about in section 1? It's probably a difficult thing to do, right? But we started with looking at the history of sports psychology. We started with what sports psychology is, what sports psychologists do, and the fact that it's not a monolithic type occupation. There are different types of sports psychologists. And then we started diving into the foundations of understanding individuals. And that word, individual, people, right? Individuals. That's probably the most important thing for section 1. Because in the second section, we're going to start talking about the group setting and the group situation. But really in this particular section, we wanted to focus on those key foundational ideas for understanding the individual, whether it's self-confidence, motivation, personality, moods, and emotions. All of these things are going to, in some way, shape, or form, influence performance. Whether it's performance for the individual, or whether it's performance eventually, because of all the individuals, for the entire team. Crucial to all of this, yes, you need to be self-reflective. Yes, you need to learn all of this stuff yourself so that you can be the best performer or the best version of yourself that you can. But also, I like to make the argument that the leaders, the coaches, the people that are going to be charged with the task of moving an entire group, more than themselves, forward, these individuals need to understand these foundational concepts as well. Because leaders that connect, leaders that understand, leaders that are able to provide personal development for individuals, those are the leaders that over time have distinguished themselves and demonstrated that they can move not only themselves, but also groups of other people forward in terms of being successful.